They electrified his own property and told him it wasn't his anymore. Gary Kellogg and his fake HOA thought they could bully an entire neighborhood into paying for a lie, using fear and intimidation to line their pockets. But what they didn't know, their latest victim was Sheriff Mike Dawson, and he was about to turn their own trap against them. And trust me, you won't believe how justice struck back harder than they ever expected. Sheriff Mike Dawson had always dreamed of a quiet life outside of work. After years of chasing criminals, dealing with bureaucratic nonsense, and handling the worst of society, he wanted nothing more than a peaceful home in a normal neighborhood. The small Texas town of Oak Ridge seemed perfect. No traffic, no noise, no unnecessary rules. Most importantly, there was no HOA. Mike had heard horror stories about overzealous homeowner associations, endless fines, ridiculous rules, and self-important board members who treated neighborhoods like their personal kingdoms. But Oak Ridge was different. Here, homeowners took care of their own properties, minded their own business, and respected each other's space. That was real freedom, or so he thought. It started subtly. At first, he noticed a few strangers in suits walking around knocking on doors, speaking in hushed tones. Most people dismissed them as salesmen or political campaigners, but then the letters started arriving. Urgent notice. Your property is now under Oak Ridge HOA jurisdiction. Mike threw his in the trash, but his neighbors didn't. One by one, they started talking. Worried whispers at the local diner, concerned faces at the grocery store. People were being told that they now had to pay HOA dues, even though no such association had ever existed. Then came the threats. A family down the street was told that they'd be fined $2,000 if they didn't clean up their yard. Their lawn was perfectly fine. An elderly couple got a letter saying their house was in violation of community standards and could be seized if they didn't comply. A single mother received a warning that her property value was at risk because she hadn't approved her home's exterior paint color, which she hadn't changed in 5 years. Mike didn't need a detective's badge to figure out what was happening. A scam. These people, Gary Kellogg, Danny Green, and Frank Davis, weren't legitimate HOA board members. There were no official records, no legal foundation, nothing. Just 3 men pretending to be in charge and shaking people down for money, and it was working. Fear spread like wildfire. Many residents, scared of losing their homes, paid up without question. Mike? He wasn't having it. The first time they knocked on his door, he barely let them finish their sales pitch before shutting it in their faces. When the letters kept coming, he ignored them. When Danny Green personally stopped him outside his house and told him that his HOA dues were overdue, Mike laughed in his face and walked away. He figured they'd get the message. He figured they'd move on. But he was wrong. The morning everything changed, Mike had a routine. Wake up, grab coffee, go for a morning walk before heading to work. But when he stepped outside that morning, his blood turned ice cold. Something was wrong. He wasn't looking at his usual open yard, his driveway, his freedom. Instead, he was trapped. A solid metal fence, tall, industrial, and completely enclosing his property, had appeared overnight. It stretched from one end of his land to the other, cutting him off completely from the street. But the fence itself wasn't even the worst part. The signs nailed onto the metal sent a clear message. Private property of Oak Ridge HOA, no trespassing. Electric fence danger, high voltage. Mike's heart pounded. He took a step forward, raising a hand toward the metal, testing how real this could possibly be. Then, crack. A bright blue spark jumped from the fence to his fingers, making his arm jolt back instinctively. The sharp sting ran up his wrist, leaving a faint tingling sensation. His jaw clenched. This wasn't a bluff. They hadn't just put up a fence. They had electrified it, a high-voltage barrier surrounding his home, his property, without permission, without warning, without a single damn legal right to do so. They had turned his house into a prison. Mike stood still for a moment, staring at the barrier that boxed him in, his fingers curled into a fist. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was war. Mike stood in front of the electrified fence, his fists clenched at his sides. He took a slow breath, inhaling through his nose, controlling the fire rising in his chest. Rage wasn't useful, not yet. He had learned long ago that anger without direction was wasted energy, and Mike Dawson didn't waste energy. Instead of acting on impulse, he turned around, walked back inside his house, and poured himself a cup of coffee. Then, he sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and started digging. If these men thought they could intimidate him into submission, they had badly miscalculated. Because the hunt had begun. Unmasking the fraud. Mike started with the obvious leads. First, he searched for any official records of an Oak Ridge HOA. Nothing. Not a single government filing, not a registered business, not even a tax document. They had no legal authority. Then he ran background checks on the three ringleaders, Gary Kellogg, Danny Green, and Frank Davis. He knew the names from the threatening letters, but now he wanted to know who they really were. And what he found? It made his jaw tighten. These men weren't just frauds, they were criminals. Gary Kellogg, the so-called president of the HOA, had a string of failed real estate ventures behind him. He had filed for bankruptcy twice, defaulted on multiple loans, and had been sued for fraudulent property sales. Danny Green, the treasurer, had a history of embezzlement. He had worked for a construction company before getting caught stealing funds from client accounts. He had managed to avoid jail time by cutting a deal, but he was banned from working in finance. Frank Davis, the enforcer, had once run a contracting business until he got sued by 6 different homeowners for fraudulent work, unfinished projects, and intimidation tactics. Their latest scam? Inventing an HOA. They had no legal charter, no board meetings, no government approval, nothing. Just 3 con artists who had figured out that fear was more profitable than business. And they weren't just playing dirty. They had done this before. Mike found complaints from other neighborhoods, small communities like his, places where people didn't ask too many questions. The same tactics, the same lies, the same extortion. But here was the difference. Those neighborhoods gave up. They paid the fees. They moved away. Nobody had fought back. Until now. Because these men had made one fatal mistake. They picked the wrong house. To them, Mike was just another stubborn homeowner refusing to pay. They didn't know he was the sheriff of the county. Hearing the horror stories. With their history exposed, Mike moved on to step 2. He needed to see the damage they had done firsthand. So he went door to door. At first, people were hesitant to talk. They still feared retaliation, still thought these men had the power to ruin them. But once Mike showed them his badge, the truth started pouring out. And what he learned? It made his blood boil. Tom Willis, a retired mechanic, had been forced to pay $8,000 in fines because the HOA claimed his driveway was too long. Too long. What the hell did that even mean? Melissa Carter, a single mother, was being harassed daily for unpaid HOA fees. Fees she never agreed to. She had put her house up for sale out of fear. Mr. and Mrs. Holloway, an elderly couple, had been told that if they didn't pay $15,000 in overdue fees, the HOA would foreclose on their house. They had already hired a lawyer, but every time they pushed back, Frank Davis would show up at their door, threatening to make their lives hell. It wasn't just money these bastards had stolen. It was security, peace of mind. They had turned people's homes into battlegrounds where fear kept them trapped, where no one dared to fight back. Until now. Mike looked each person in the eye, and every time he told them the same thing. I'm going to take care of this. And for the first time in months, people believed it. The line in the sand Mike returned home that evening, stepping past the metal fence that still surrounded his property. He could still hear the faint hum of the electricity running through the wires. He placed his hands on his hips and looked up at the sky, inhaling deeply through his nose. He had 2 choices. He could do what most people had done, file a complaint, wait months for legal action, hope that a judge eventually saw the fraud for what it was, or he could handle it himself because the law was already on his side. These men were committing multiple felonies: extortion, fraud, wire fraud, reckless endangerment. They had turned a man's home into a prison. And he was done waiting. Mike pulled out his phone and made a single call. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "I need a team ready by morning." A pause. "No, we're not waiting on warrants. We have more than enough probable cause." Another pause. because these guys have no idea they just pissed off the wrong damn sheriff. He hung up. Then he walked inside, took off his badge, set it on the table, and started planning how to end this. Mike Dawson had spent years dealing with criminals, liars, conmen, and manipulators. He had seen them bully the weak, prey on fear, and walk away smiling. But today, those smiles were going to disappear, because this time they had messed with the wrong man. And Mike, he was done playing nice, setting the trap. Mike could have filed charges, could have sent a legal team after them, could have let the system grind them down, but that wasn't good enough. They needed to feel powerless, just like they had made every terrified homeowner feel. So instead of showing up with a warrant, Mike picked up his phone and called Gary Kellogg. "All right," he said, his voice stouty. "I'm ready to negotiate. Meet me at my house." Gary chuckled. "Knew you'd come around." Click. Mike put his phone down. Outside, his deputies were already in position. Now, it was just a matter of waiting. The last meeting. 20 minutes later, a black SUV pulled up. Gary, Danny, and Frank stepped out, smirking like they had already won. "Well, well," Gary said, flashing a grin. "Looks like you finally came to your senses, Sheriff." Mike stayed calm, unreadable. "Let's check out this fence of yours," he said, motioning toward the barrier. They followed, amused by his sudden compliance. They had no idea what was coming. The moment it turned, Mike stopped in front of the metal fence, then casually leaned against it. Danny's brows furrowed. "Careful there, Sheriff. That thing's hot." Mike smirked. They didn't know his deputies had already cut the power. "You said the voltage is low, right?" he asked. Gary grinned. "Yeah, just a little shock." Mike grabbed him by the collar and shoved him against the fence. Gary recoiled, eyes wide, waiting for the searing pain. But nothing happened. Danny panicked, lunged forward to pull him back. And that's when the real power was switched on. A sharp jolt of electricity surged through Danny's hands, making him yelp and stumble backward. Not enough to harm him, but enough to send a clear message. Frank froze. "What the hell, man? You can't do that." Mike pulled out his badge. "Oh, but I can." And then, sirens. Squad cars screeched to a stop. Deputies swarmed in. "Hands where we can see them!" Within seconds, all three men were face down in the dirt, handcuffed and powerless. Mike leaned in close to Gary. "You wanted to put me behind a fence?" he murmured. Gary clenched his jaw. Mike smirked. "Looks like you'll be spending some time behind bars instead." He turned away as the squad cars pulled out, the dust settling behind them. And for the first time in months, Oak Ridge was finally free. The trial wasn't just swift, it was brutal. The prosecutors didn't hold back. One by one, the victims took the stand. The retired mechanic who had been forced to drain his savings to pay fake HOA fines. The single mother who had been harassed into selling her home. The elderly couple who had nearly lost everything. Their testimonies painted a picture of fear, manipulation, and outright theft. The evidence was ironclad. Bank statements, wire transfers, threatening letters signed by Gary Kellogg, Danny Green, and Frank Davis. The defense tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, a legitimate business venture that had gone wrong. The jury didn't buy it. The deliberation lasted less than an hour. Guilty. Fraud, extortion, illegal property seizure, reckless endangerment. Each charge stacked one after the other, like nails sealing their fate. And when the judge handed down the maximum sentence, Mike watched as the three men, who had once strutted through the neighborhood like they owned it, were let out in handcuffs, their faces pale, their futures reduced to prison bars. For the first time since this all started, they weren't the ones holding the power. They were powerless. Making things right. With the scammers gone, it was time to fix the damage they had done, the money they had stolen. Every last dollar was returned. A civil lawsuit made sure every homeowner got full restitution, plus additional damages. The fake HOA's assets and land seized by the county. At first, there were concerns that some corporate developer would swoop in, snatching up the lots and turning them into overpriced housing. But this time, the community stood together. They pooled their resources, fought the legal red tape, and won. And instead of letting some greedy outsider take control, they built something for themselves. A community reclaimed. Months later, Mike found himself walking the same familiar streets, but this time the air was lighter. Gone were the fearful glances and the whispered conversations. People smiled again. A few waved at him as he passed. He didn't think much of it. He was never one to seek attention. But then, as he turned the corner, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. The park, where the fake HOA's signs had once stood, where they had tried to claim land that was never theirs, there was now a space for everyone. Children laughed as they ran through the grass. Parents sat on benches, chatting. Someone had even put up a small playground with donated funds, and right at the entrance, mounted on a polished stone plaque, was something else. Mike stepped closer and read the inscription, dedicated to the people who stood against corruption, and to Sheriff Mike, our real protector. He exhaled slowly, a feeling settling in his chest that was hard to describe. Mike had never wanted recognition. He hadn't done this for a thank you or for praise, but standing there, watching his community thrive, knowing that the people he had fought for were finally free of fear, that was justice, and that was enough.